So I'll just introduce myself. Timmee Grinham's my name. I am a teacher of some years. I've been a member of the RBA Educators Panel for a little while now, and I also do a bit of textbook stuff and other contributions to curriculums. So my first point when I wanted to start with this was just have a think about where is it that we have to focus on GDP. So I did have a look at a lot of the curricula, and I was very grateful to NESA for the fact that they hadn't updated their curriculum in a little while, so I didn't have to update that. But yeah, so there's obviously, you would know this, but it's really interesting to see that across all of the syllabi, across all the states, systems, they have a lot in common in terms of the treatment of GDP, aggregate demand factors, and that sort of thing. So measurement of economic growth. Now, the criticisms of GDP are quite specific in Victoria to our earlier curriculum, so our Year 11 curriculum rather than our Year 12 curriculum. And that's about criticisms and limitations, but GDP per capita certainly comes back in the Year 12 curriculum. We consider that as a sort of proxy measure of material living standards. Factors influencing economic growth. So there you're talking about your aggregate demand, aggregate supply factors. I'll talk a little bit more about how to, working with those in the classroom, why economic growth is important and the link to living standards, and the circular flow model of income and how the levels of injections and leakages affect economic activity and economic growth. And then we also look quite a lot in Victoria at policies used to influence economic growth. And in the Year 11 syllabus, there's definitely a focus on that sort of idea of trade-off, that there can be a trade-off between economic growth and environmental sustainability, but also they can sometimes be complementary if it's the right kind of economic growth that includes things like an energy transition. And they all require skills like selecting, analysing and evaluating data and issues, and evaluating and predicting economic outcomes. The 7 to 10 curriculum also includes things like different ways of measuring our economic performance. And what you'll hopefully get out of this presentation is that a lot of these things, apart probably from the graphs from the RBA chart pack, is that in fact a lot of these things can be used if you're wanting to teach about GDP to kids in Year 9 or 10, which I do very briefly, I must say, my Year 10 elective. And government economic performance in terms of improving living standards, and they are also developing in these earlier years these skills around analysing information, gathering data, developing questions. And it's been lovely to hear all of you talk so much about questions, like ask really great questions today. I think it's one of the skills of being an economics teacher and a student of economics is you learn how to ask questions, like good questions that really interrogate what you're being told. And applying economics concepts in new and hypothetical situations. I'm sure you've all been to this page. If you haven't, you are missing out big time. There are enormous amounts of data, information and support materials there. I'd like to start with this reading and interpreting charts. When I first started working with the RBA on the EAP, one of the observations that was made is that because there are a certain number of teachers at any given time who don't have a really strong economics training and they are teaching economics, they might not feel super confident in actually reading or teaching kids about reading and interpreting graphically represented information. You will have observed, if you spend any time on the RBA website or any time at RBA Professional Learning or looked at any of their videos, charts are the bomb. They are it. They are the thing that economists rely on. And yes, that aggregated data can sometimes disguise all sorts of differences, but it also can tell us stories. And so we have to teach our students effectively how to be able to interpret charts. But for some teachers, that's a challenge. And certainly for some students, they need not just for you to stand up the front and say to them, this is how you do it, but to actually practice that skill. So this is an excellent resource. It was developed by someone who worked for the program, but you'll hear from him later today, called Gigi. And Gigi is an economist. He now works in domestic markets, so he works in the implementation of monetary policy. But he used to work with the program as one of the people who was developing resources, and he's created some videos. The first one is explaining why you should know how to read charts and why charts are so much better than a table of data sometimes, because it makes a lot more sense in terms of, particularly as a visual learner, I'm obsessed with charts, love what they say to me, love the fact that they tell a story. And I think that there's probably quite a few people in this room who like that too. I'd much rather look at a chart than a table of data. Sometimes tables of data are really useful, but also sometimes charts are great too. So he talks through that, and he explains how to pull a chart apart. What are you looking at in terms of your axes? What are you looking at in terms of your unit of measurement? What are you looking at a volume or value in terms of your unit of measurement, or are you actually looking at a percentage change of growth? And the challenge for me with teaching senior economics is students getting their head around the idea that something is growing at any rate, it's getting bigger. If it's above zero and it's a growth measure, the thing is getting bigger. The fact that the graph is trending downwards doesn't mean it's getting smaller. But I think, honestly, for us, that's obvious. For them, it's not so much so. So that's the first part. Then he talks through some examples, and then connected to that is actually an illustrator for your classroom wall, which you can put up with an annotated graph. And the final thing is a worksheet. Now, these haven't been put in your packs, but they're very accessible through the website. Now, just be mindful, unlike the RBA presentations, my slides have words as well as pictures, because I want you to be able to take this away and actually go back and say, oh, that's how you use that thing. So it has basic instructions. So yes, it's about students applying that skill to a series of charts. And it's a way you could use it if you're in those early stages of teaching students to read charts. Find them under the teacher materials, under learning activities, rather than under the resources, by the way. Second thing you can do, key economic indicators. Now, this economic indicator snapshot is updated regularly, a new one comes out each month. They do have the date of publication on them, but they do take down the old ones. So my recommendation is you download it each month so that you've got the old copy, and then what you can do is have them up on the wall and watch how the economy has changed over the year. If you wanted to, you could also allocate students to unpack parts of the snapshot. Now, not all of these elements in the snapshot are going to be 100% relevant to every classroom, but obviously the cash rate target, the rate of economic growth, the current inflation reading, the unemployment rate, and potentially employment growth as well. Wages growth, which, as we've talked about a bit today, is sometimes considered as a contributor, but not always, to inflation, and that's up for debate, depending on current economic circumstances. And then obviously the value of the Australian dollar and how China's going, because we all know that so much of Australia's prosperity relies on Chinese economic growth. So what they would do is they would choose the indicator. This is really good in Year 11 where you've got a bit more time. Choose the indicator, explain why it's important, compare the current performance with previous performances, refer to the earlier snapshots, and then provide a brief evaluation of overall economic performance in terms of that indicator. Another thing you can do, and this is another task that's up on the RBA website under the teachers' materials, is to actually get the students to unpack each part of that snapshot themselves, and the instructions are right there. So I won't talk you through that, but it's all about using the information to actually unpack those indicators and what they show about the economy. So, for example, is a 1.1% growth in the latest snapshot, annual or quarterly? What does it say about economic growth in the economy's performance? And how does it compare to previous performances? Now, this is something I'm going to flag for you, because even though it says it's been designed it's under the teacher materials, modules for Year 9 and 10, I use this in my senior classes. It's actually about all of those elements of our circular flow model, the components of the circular flow model of the economy, and the idea of leakages and injections that then affect the level of economic activity. I really like it because even though it's designed for the middle years, it's very accessible. There are two illustrators that you can put up. These are effectively the answers on the wall that talk about the business cycle. And then there's a few activities. So you can complete the circular flow model. You're given all the little names, and then the kids insert them into the diagram. Injections and leakages, they have a bit of a discussion about whether they think the particular action that's being specified would be an injection or a leakage, and which part or sector of the economy would it influence. And also there's some business case, cycle case studies, which are little descriptions of particular activities that are happening. So somebody decides they've observed that they're selling out very early in their business, and they've decided to expand their business by borrowing. What part of the economic cycle are we likely to be describing there? Or whether they've observed that interest rates are going up, or they've observed inflation's very high. So I do find the students really benefit from this. It makes it more real from them than me standing up and actually drawing the circular flow model and trying to unpack that for them. Another one, the RBA explainer on economic growth has quite a bit of the unpacking of the sorts of things Kate's been talking about today, and it's a great resource for teachers. I've come up with a couple of activities for using that in class. The first one is one of the things that Kate nodded to in her presentation, which was the limitations of GDP as a measure of wellbeing. So you use the explainer as a starting point, and I've created a worksheet. Now, I will tell you, the worksheets will be provided to you electronically, but they are not printed out and put in your pack. But I will just do a bit of show and tell. So this is what the worksheet looks like. First little activity is what is and isn't counted in GDP, again with some scenarios. This is using the most recent graph of the GDP versus GDP per capita growth, and asking students to reflect on what do we mean by GDP per capita, what you've learned about in class, what do we mean by a technical recession, what do we mean by a GDP per capita or a per capita recession, which has been in the press a little bit recently. There's also a thing on considering how effectively GDP represents, it might represent a snapshot of the average material living standards of the average Australian, and we all know there is no such thing as the average Australian. So what is the level of inequality in income distribution that's actually in a particular place, and how would that impact upon, for example, the effectiveness of GDP as a measure of average living standards in a particular country? So I've provided up-to-date information about Gini coefficients for just a select group of countries. I've mostly chosen countries that have somewhat similar economies to ours, or certainly levels of levels of development, but you could certainly mix that up a little bit. And then you could get the students to do an evaluation of GDP as a measure of wellbeing. GDP as a measure of wellbeing is certainly something we consider in the Victorian syllabus, but only really at year 11 rather than at year 12. And also one other thing you can use, it's not an RBA resource, but recently the government last year announced the Measuring What Matters framework, which is not super easy to navigate, but you can find it, I think it's through Treasury, and you can have a look around there at some of the measures that they are using. It's somewhat of a substitute for their measures of Australia's progress, which the ABS used to publish until about 10 years ago. So you will receive a copy of that worksheet. Another idea is this this idea of comparing the performance of the economy in terms of GDP versus GDP or GDP growth compared to GDP per capita growth, and getting them to develop skills in interpreting data and making judgments about what it shows. And again, graph, series of questions asking them to reflect on the meaning of each of those, asking questions like, define real GDP and briefly explain how it's measured, and then explain the difference between real GDP growth, and how real GDP is calculated. And I think if we can reinforce to our students as much as possible to be very clear about whether they're talking about values and levels or they're talking about growth rates. And then ask them to think about why, and this is certainly relevant for our Year 12 course, and I think for many of you, why do we use GDP per capita as a proxy for material living standards? And that is often assumed to be an article of faith, but as we've had conversations today and earlier this morning, that is not necessarily always accepted, and there can be criticisms of that. And then asking them to talk about that idea that Australia is experiencing what in the media is referred to as a per capita recession. I think it's worth them understanding that. Okay, so that's that one. Another activity that I've done for many years now teaching senior economics is actually giving the kids a series of charts taken from the latest chart pack. And I take out, probably remember doing this, Chris, yeah, poor kid. So I select a variety that are indicators that are often used as measures of how, or factors that will impact particular components of aggregate demand or the overall aggregate supply conditions in the economy. So it includes things like household income and consumption. You've seen those graphs already today. The consumer sentiment index, the wage price index growth, the NAB business survey, Australia's dollar, growth in our major trading partners, particularly with China. What else? Oh, the price of oil, of course, per barrel, West Texas Intermediate, and labour market indicators, government budget balances, public construction work. And I get them to, first of all, have a look at those graphs and tell me, okay, so is that a factor that would influence aggregate demand, or is that a factor that's more likely to influence aggregate supply? How has it been performing over X period of time? Now, in my syllabus, it's about a 2-year period. You may have a longer period that your students need to understand. But, if I put this in front of students, it's the wage price index growth graph, and we've had, and this is a great one, because students immediately say, oh, well, that's obviously just going to affect consumption. And I say, well, actually, with wage prices, what we're mostly talking about is the cost for an employer. Yes, it's going to potentially impact consumption, but we're also looking at the impact on aggregate supply through costs of production. So I actually find that a fairly useful task to do early on when you're first teaching aggregate demand and aggregate supply concepts. And the great thing is, once you've got the sort of framework, you just slot in the new graphs every year. So each year I just put in new graphs. And those all they are all from the chart pack, so they're very readily accessible. And this is when you can start doing what every person who has stood up here today, except for me, has done, which is show you that every chart tells a story. And so when I would actually say to them, tell me a story about this chart. And obviously I'd give them some guidance because they're 16 or 17 years old. First of all, I'm going to tell them household consumption. What do we mean by that? First of all, they would probably identify that it's an aggregate demand component. I love this graph because I love the way it breaks down discretionary versus essential spend. And it shows, and I say to them, okay, so what are those two big spikes up about? And what's the big spike down? And then they'll use the word COVID. And I say, yeah, but I need more. I need more. Why did we go crazy with discretionary spending after COVID finished? Well, after it stopped being a pandemic, a crisis. But also, why did our discretionary spend fall? And then they say, oh, that's right, they shut the restaurants down. Now, this is a way of saying to them, the things that are happening to you in your life every day are things that are absolutely going to impact on these graphs and our economy. And these graphs represent an aggregation of the experiences of all the different people who are a little bit like you and a bit different to you across the whole country. So getting them to unpack those, talking them through its story, why? How much will it affect the economy? This is also an opportunity to bring in the idea of the multiplier effect and also the marginal propensity to consume. And also things like, now we know that in fact consumption only contributes 50%, not 60%, as I've been teaching for the last 25 years, to aggregate demand. How is this going to impact the economy? Because you and we might be quite comfortable reading the statement on monetary policy, or at least bits of it, but our kids aren't going to be up for that mostly. Why do we do this? Practicing those skills, analysing relationships, making predictions, encouraging them to develop questions. What's that showing me? What are are there any limitations to this data? What conclusions, what outcomes might be the result of this? What do you need to ask to make sense of a graph? Can you find out the answers to some of those questions? Can they explain them to others? That sort of stuff. So anyway, that's just one of my things that I love doing. And I do end up with a few nerds every year who actually do like graphs. So that makes me very happy, because I don't know about you, but I actually, these days I only teach girls. I have taught boys in the past. And I find there's a bit of anxiety around numbers, data, trends, percentages, ratios. The more you can make it comfortable for them, the better they're going to be. The more you can domesticate it by showing them this stuff, bringing it to life, the less panicked they will be about it. And one of my key goals is to encourage lots of girls to do economics, because we've already got plenty of guys doing economics, but, it'd be great to have some more young women doing it. Another final activity with the economic growth explainer is you could actually say to the students, all right, I'm setting you some homework, and you have to read the explainer outside of class and come up with 10 questions that you can ask students in the class, and you can set what kinds of questions you want them to ask. So 2 relating to aggregate demand, 1 relating to aggregate supply, 1 relating to real versus nominal, 1 on the multiplier, 1 on the role of monetary policy operating counter-cyclically, for example. And then discuss those questions in class and help them to modify or improve them. Then use those questions as part of classwork or revision. And this is the absolute bonus for them. You get them to write some sample answers to 1 or 2 of them, and then you promise that a couple of those questions will turn up on the internal assessment. That nothing incentivizes them like knowing that a question they have written, if it's good enough, might end up on the paper, and they've already got, they know what it might be. So that's one way to motivate them. Okay. Another great way to do this, and I absolutely do, another great thing to do with the explainer is to use that visual representation of the aggregate demand equation that Kate already showed you, and it's been reproduced on here, to actually get them to create a poster. And there's nothing like, as you would all know, a Friday afternoon period 6 on a hot day or a windy day or whatever, anything really, and all of a sudden, give them some scissors, some sticky tape, get them, or some glue, and get them working in groups. And you start with, stick this equation in the middle, stick each of the components around the outside, and then give them a series of scenarios. They cut up the scenarios and they link them to the components of aggregate demand, and they identify, will it be a favourable or an unfavourable impact on aggregate demand, ceteris paribus. Now, it's a great way to identify what they don't understand and what they've misunderstood about how you have taught it, because they will say things, and it's also a great way of exposing your own vulnerability to them, because you make mistakes, and anyway. But they often will misclassify things, they will talk about, it's a great way of them, for example, you checking that they understand the impact of a depreciating Australian dollar on aggregate demand. Or the idea of export demand being driven by Chinese growth, whereas import demand is driven by domestic growth. And I think that it's very useful, and also similar for labour, for aggregate supply. The RBA has identified 3 key drivers of aggregate supply: labour, capital and productivity. I mean, I tend to teach it in terms of costs of production, availability and quality of resources, productivity, efficiency, that sort of stuff. But you can do the same. You can get them to, like you've got aggregate supply scenarios, and you get them to indicate what they are. So hopefully that's clear. Feel free to ask me questions at the end if it's not clear what I'm suggesting you do. But the other thing I've left free 6 boxes, and they come up with their own scenarios and they can test those out on their classmates. And that's always a bit of an extra challenge for them, which they don't like, but they can do it anyway. Okay, so again, you could get the latest contributions to GDP growth from the last year if you wanted to, and you could ask them to, again, annotate the diagram with the images from the AD formula, the consumption, noting that, in fact, when we unpack this data, we often end up with a disaggregated dwelling, mining and non-mining investment as all those private investment components, and then the government component and the export and import. And this is a great way of showing them that higher imports detracts from GDP, because you can see that when imports are larger, they are detracting from GDP, and that's very clear from that graph. What does this tell us about the economy over the last 12 months? Not a great story, but not the worst in the world for sure. And again, you could get these 2 charts. I liked actually having a look at this because I asked the bank for my presentation to create a new chart, which was the annual contribution to average annual growth over the 10 years, 2012 to 13 to 2022-23, and then the most recent annual contributions. And you can see the real shift there. You can see the real shift. Well, first of all, you can see there's been a substantial fall in GDP growth over that period. You can see that, in fact, investment is making a contribution in a way that it wasn't necessarily in the past, but also that government expenditure is a very substantial contributor. Now, this sheet I don't have a show and tell version of, my apologies, but it is about that idea of actual versus potential GDP. On the, I think it's on the Economic Growth Explainer, there is this graph. When I start teaching about counter-cyclical aggregate demand management policy at the start of Unit 4 in Victoria, which is basically fiscal and monetary, I put this up and I say, well, if we think, and I checked this was true with Tom Rosewall, who's a senior economist here at the bank, that could we say that potential line is aggregate supply, and the actual is aggregate demand. When we have our aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply, we end up with those peak business cycle conditions. When we have our aggregate demand lower than our potential output, then we have those poor, weak economic conditions that are in the trough or the downturn of our economic cycle. And I checked that with Tom and he said, yes, that's a fine way to talk about it. So I actually have a sheet, which you'll get a copy of, where getting them to talk about the likely conditions, I actually take the labels off. So I just give them the graph and I ask them, well, what would unemployment look like during that period where the sort of garden green line is above the lime green line? And what would unemployment inflation be likely to look like? The Australian economy is not doing a good job of behaving itself in terms of all of this, but, we're learning the theory. If we actually were in those other conditions in a weaker, the downturn or the trough period of our business cycle, and get them to justify their predictions and how it might affect monetary policy settings. So there is a copy of that coming around to you. A couple of last few things. RBA Explainer. The COVID pandemic explainer, I must say, someone who lived through the Melbourne lockdowns, I had a few moments of sort of PTSD flashbacks, thinking, oh yeah, that's right. Oh, that's right. But it was great for me to actually clarify the massive impact on all of us of that period, not just obviously economically, but the social disruption. And my experience as students, there are quite a lot of students in my classes who are also doing some form of history, and they love economic history. They find it quite engaging. They find that idea that economics, politics, history, and geography are all very much overlapping. it still looms large in their lives. I mean, it's quite recent for them. Some of my students, they did 3 years of their education with constant interruptions, or 2.5 years of their very formative life. And I like the way that this graph shows the enormity of the impact on the GDP, because it actually shows you the early 30s, so the Great Depression, the World War II, the downturn after World War II, and then the next biggest one is the 2020 recession. So it also allows you to start talking about the link between material and non-material living standards, those job losses, the GDP contraction, the lockdowns, and not just the economic and material impact, but the social and emotional losses and impact that people experienced. I'm not sure about you, but I am finding that my students are struggling. Yeah. It's a big adjustment to come back to what they're dealing with now. Now, I don't know if you've ever run a mock meeting for the RBA, but this is a great activity. It's one of the earliest ones we did when the Educators Advisory Panel first set up. It was one of the first ones that the program set up. And what it is that you give the students the information, which is that there is a presentation on the latest economic conditions that comes out shortly after each statement on monetary policy is released, and it has a summary of those conditions. There's also a great one that Emma Chow, who is one of the people who works in the program, has created specifically for high school students. Very accessible, brilliant unpacking of graphs. If you haven't shown it to your class, you have to. It's 8 minutes long. Really good. Absolutely worth a look. And it then says, well, this is some of the data, some of the evidence the RBA uses to influence its decision. Find out what the indicator is. What's happened to that indicator recently? It's a little bit like that aggregate demand, aggregate supply activity before, but here you're actually looking specifically at the implications for monetary policy settings. And then you have a discussion in class as a board, should we not? And then they have to say, like if you're looking at this chart, GDP growth and labour underutilisation rates, how is this likely to affect the RBA's decision, the RBA board's decision, I should say? And then students write up their decision, and then they would compare it to a future RBA decision or the next time the RBA met. Now, look, if that's something that's way too much for your class, I actually just get them to get into a corner, raise, hold, lower. That's not a corner, but like in a row, raise, hold, lower. And then you have to tell me why. Why will they raise? Why will they hold? Why will they go lower? And then you record it, and then you hold them to account. So what did the RBA say that was different? Yeah. I think that sort of stuff I know that for some kids, wouldn't matter what we did, we could dance around with hats on our heads and they might not be excited, but the kids who are in your class who are going to be engaged with this and understand the impact on their lives, they will take this on board. Now, if you haven't used these two, this is gold. The snapshot comparison and the inflation explorer. So the inflation explorer allows you to enter a dollar value, choose a series so we all know that the basket, the regimen is made up of 11 key subcategories. You get to choose either the categories or the CPI overall. So what I chose, and I did this quite recently, 2023, I updated this. For a household that spent $100 per week in 1980 on the consumer goods basket, they would be spending $510 now. And that it gives you not just the total price change, but the average annual price change over that period. And you'll see that if we took from 1980 to now, and 1980 is pre-targeting. So, and we've been outside the band for a little while now, but you can see that on average we haven't been inside the target band of 2 to 3%. Great activity, really engaging, right through from about year 9 onwards, I'd say, even year 8, depending on how much they can be trusted on the computers. Snapshot comparison. This allows you to choose periods of time. So what I did was I said, well, from January 2022, May 2024. I love the chart pack, but it has its limitations. I really don't need a GDP chart that shows me back to 1956, or even a terms of trade chart that takes me back to the wool boom in the Korean War. What I need is something my kids can use now and interpret easily without being distracted by the fact that it's hard to read the x-axis. So you go in here and you make your bespoke charts for your assessment tasks, do it every time. And this is what I ended up with. GDP, particular period, and it's actually interactive in that you can scroll over when it's live and you're on the screen and it will show you those actual values as you go along. And you can tailor those. Now, the only limitation is it doesn't have everything, and there are things that are only in the chart pack, but it has, GDP, the Australian dollar, the unemployment rate. Obviously, it has the cash rate. It has cash target rate, I should say, and it also has inflation and things like that. Okay. I'll finish up now. I just want to say speeches from the RBA can be great. There's some really interesting stuff in those. Obviously, when the governor talks to the press about the monetary policy decision, that's always quite lively, and that can be fun. And the lovely thing about the transcript is that it's got all the names and where they come from of all of the journalists asking particular questions, and you start to pick up on a sort of a tenor or a tone of particular people who report on the economy. The second thing is the bulletin. Now, there's a number of amazing articles in here, particularly, obviously, they're for teachers more than their students, unless you've got somebody incredibly capable in your class. But one of my favourites is actually about girls and economics and the confidence gap. And I don't know if you've read it, but if you teach economics to girls, you have to read this. It is your moral obligation to read this research. Girls are better at economics than they think they are, and it's our job to fix that. I don't know how we do it. There's a PhD in it, but this young person, Joyce Pan, is an absolute legend. She's wanted to be an economist for a very long time, and I know that because I taught her high school economics. She's just great. And she did this research, and we have to do something about this. So the other thing that's changed is the way the statement on monetary policy is delivered, which is really a lot more engaging. I think the comms department's done a great job here, by the way, because love a picture, love an in brief, love a summary, this is what it means, because that is not evident in the old ones. And as somebody with economics training, I could make sense of it. But I find it increasingly accessible, and that means that we can send our students there possibly. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is an article about why we should be telling students this is a speech delivered that explains why we should be telling students to study economics. And one of the reasons is that jobs with increasing use of AI, we're going to need jobs that have that are non-routine cognitive jobs rather than routine cognitive jobs, and economics is most definitely a non-routine cognitive job. Yes, some of the analysis can be done by the computer, but most of it's about humans, so it's mostly humans who are going to have to do it. And also, there's a skill wage premium. So you can see that economics does quite well in the earnings by field of bachelor study. It's a few years old, but still, I like to show them that. And my last slide is former head of the EAP program, Jackie, who's recently taken on another role in the bank. She gave a speech and she showed us what's happening to economics enrolments. Now, I'm very heartened by the fact that the fall seems to have been arrested and we're experiencing a very slight upward trend. So I want us all to try to accelerate the trend. What we do have to do is arrest the decline in the number of females studying economics.